We will be capturing all public input on this first draft during our public review period, which will run through Sunday night, August 21st. And the public comments will inform the revised first draft that we'll submit to the state at the end of August. The housing element is a really important plan. It's a great opportunity to talk about how we can plan for a future so that we are stronger together. We need to plan for a certain amount of housing, but we also need to put in place programs and policies that affirmatively further fair housing. This plan is about more housing, but it's also about how we grow, where we invest, and how we make sure that no group is left behind. So thank you for your interest in this work and for sharing your thoughts with us this evening. We encourage you to stay engaged with the housing element and the assessment of fair housing work through the next few months. Next slide, please. And as we start our meeting tonight, the city would like to acknowledge that San Jose sits on the ancestral lands of Native tribes, including the Muwekma Ohlone tribe and Aboriginal homeland of the Tamian Nation. We recognize the resilience of Native culture and community. Let us acknowledge with respect all Indigenous peoples who have a relationship with the land, have stewarded this land throughout the generations, and not forget the painful history of colonization. The Housing Department and our partners in the Planning, Building, and Code Enforcement Department acknowledge this history as we work together towards a more equitable and inclusive future. Thank you. And with that, I'll give it back to Paul.
Great. Thank you, Kristen. Just a few Zoom logistics before we get into the meat of the housing element and talk about what's in the draft housing element and begin to get your feedback on it. Obviously, we're in Zoom world, so and we have interpretation available. Next slide, please. If you would keep yourselves muted during the meeting, that would be great. It would be very helpful. We would like to see you, though. I think it would be builds more community if we can actually see you and you feel comfortable turning your cameras on. If you do have questions that you'd like or comments to share, feel free to put those in the chat. And also feel free to use your reactions buttons, either the thumbs up or thumbs down or heart or any other reactions buttons. Next slide, please. Great. So our agenda for this evening is we've just done our welcome. We're going to do a presentation now from Ruth Cueto and Josh Ishimatsu at the City of San Jose, who will go through all of the draft housing element. And then we'll spend most of the meeting in one of 4 breakout rooms doing a deep dive into the housing element and one of its various sections to get your feedback. We'll come back at 7:20 from the breakout rooms to do a wrap up and deep dive, and also to get your feedback on this meeting and to let you know about future opportunities for providing feedback and participation. Next slide, please. So with that, I think I'm going to turn it over to Josh and Ruth.
Thanks, Paul. So my name is Ruth Cueto. I am with Planning, Building, Code Enforcement, and I'm a supervising planner and working on the housing element update. So what is the housing element? The housing element is a city's official housing policy document. It's required by state law and it's incorporated into each city's general plan to guide housing policy. The current housing element expires in 2023, and our next element will go from 2023 to 2031. And it's due to the State of California Department of Housing and Community Development in early 2023. In addition to fulfilling state law and refreshing our housing policies, the update is also an opportunity to have a conversation with San Jose's residents and stakeholders about San Jose's growth and development. Next slide, please. So our process for the housing element update actually started in 2019 with the Housing Department's Assessment of Fair Housing, or AFH process. Initial findings from the AFH process were presented to City Council in June of last year and have been incorporated into the housing element draft. We launched the community outreach and engagement process for the housing element update in September 2021 and have had a series of meetings and events over several phases. Tonight's meeting is part of phase 4, and it's the review of the draft housing element. Based on public review, we will submit the next iteration of this document to the State of California's Housing and Community Development Department. The last round of public involvement will be the public hearings, culminating with City Council review and approval in early 2023. Input from community members is very important, and it's a very important part of this process. Next slide. So this housing element document contains these 5 chapters stated here, along with several appendices. This is all on our website. And what we're going to do is spend the remainder of the presentation describing each of these at a very high level. We encourage you to read the sections that you're most interested in if you haven't already. Next slide. So chapter 1 describes the purpose of the housing element and how the document is organized. The bulk of the chapter describes the public outreach and engagement process. And as I mentioned earlier, we've conducted multiple phases of outreach, each involving a range of methods for reaching and engaging community members. The aim has been to provide a variety of opportunities to participate and to address barriers to participation for underrepresented populations. In chapter 1, we analyze these barriers and describe our efforts to conduct an inclusive process. It also summarizes what we've heard through the process and what we've done to incorporate community input and feedback. We will continue to evaluate and adapt the process. We welcome your feedback on how it goes, how it's gone, and your suggestions for the future. Next slide, please. I'll hand it over to Josh.
Hi, everybody. My name is Josh Ishimatsu, he, him, and I am the policy team manager for the City of San Jose Housing Department. And I'll be presenting an overview of chapters 2 and 3 of the draft housing element, and also some of the appendices that are directly related to these chapters. So starting with chapter 2 of the document is a brief summary of the city's housing needs and our current housing and demographic landscape, especially in terms of fair housing. So chapter 2 is a summary and provide some of the highlights, while the more detailed analyses, the more complete and detailed analyses are in appendices A and B. Our findings here include that housing costs have been rising substantially in San Jose and that we're one of the most expensive cities in the country. For a city our size, we have a high proportion of single-family homes, including one of the highest percentages of residential land dedicated to single-family uses. And a large proportion of this housing stock was built between 1950 and 1980, when San Jose had its largest growth spurt. The majority of this growth spurt happened before fair housing laws were passed. And how and when San Jose grew continues to influence our current conditions, especially in terms of segregation and how this impacts opportunity across neighborhoods. Next slide, please. So California Assembly Bill 686 now requires that all housing elements address fair housing directly. This means that we have to perform a rigorous analysis of both our history and our current conditions. And in addition, we have to propose policies and programs that address any fair housing issues that we identify in this analysis. But first and foremost, the thing that we need to do is perform the assessment, which is included in the housing element document as Appendix B. So it's an assessment of fair housing, and Ruth used the abbreviation AFH before. Like I mentioned during the previous slide, chapter 2 contains some of the highlights of our fair housing analysis, but the core of our analysis is in Appendix B, like I said. And in that appendix, where we did state required analyses such as integration and segregation by race, disparities in housing and opportunity, demographics by housing type, analysis of housing needs for specific populations, fair housing enforcement and a summary of our fair housing enforcement and outreach capacity. Some of our findings from the assessment of fair housing include, by the sort of the data-driven measurements required by the state of California, San Jose is one of the most segregated cities in the greater Bay Area. Of the 100 plus cities, San Jose is right up there in the top 5 across most of these metrics, and some at the very top. The patterns of segregation that exist in our current city are consistent with the same patterns of segregation dating back to redlining maps of the 1930s, and have been consistent throughout the growth period of the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. This history and the current reality of segregation means that there has been systematic underinvestment in specific communities, and that there have been generational disparities in access to opportunity and to wealth building that still continue today. Next slide, please. So, as Ruth mentioned, one of the big things about the housing element is that we have to present goals of the number of housing units to produce. But as Kristen said, in addition to these goals of housing to produce, we have to present goals and strategies, and these goals and strategies should directly address the needs, constraints, and barriers that we identify elsewhere in the document. So importantly, all of these goals must be advanced in ways that affirmatively further fair housing. So chapter 3, summarizing chapter 3 now, defines the five major goals. So goal 1, that an abundant and affordable housing stock. Goal 2, sufficient housing for people experiencing homelessness. Goal 3, housing stability and opportunities to build wealth for all residents. Goal 4, healthy, thriving neighborhoods with access to good jobs, schools, transportation, and other amenities. So I want to emphasize here that this is also a part of fair housing. So this is about making sure that all residents, no matter where they live, all residents' experience outside of their house is decent and safe. Goal 5, racially and socially inclusive neighborhoods that overcome past and present discrimination. The law tells us that jurisdictions need to redress past discrimination, that we need to overcome patterns of segregation, and to make our communities more inclusive places where all types of people live, especially those who are, who have experienced past discrimination, especially those who are in what the law calls protected classes. So the city reviewed input on these goals in previous public meetings and in a community-wide survey in our last phase of outreach. Next slide, please. So underneath each goal are housing strategies that the city will do alone and with partners during the next 8 years. These strategies consist of programs that we might run, or an activity we might do, like a process improvement, or a new policy that we would seek to establish. At this stage of the process, the housing document, the housing element, is still in draft form. These programs, policies, and activities are proposals, and we're here to listen to your feedback on them. However, once the city council adopts the housing element and it is approved by the state of California, the city of San Jose will become legally accountable to follow through on the items in the housing element. This slide maps each of the 5 overarching goals that I talked through in the last slide, with which are abbreviated here to the kinds of strategies covered by these goals. So that is, the numbers here on the slide are the same as the goals in the last slide, and I'm going to give a little bit more detail under each of them. So under goal number 1, which is about an abundant and affordable housing stock, we have strategies that focus on different ways the city can increase production of market rate and affordable housing, and how we might also preserve existing housing, both market rate and affordable. Under goal 2, sufficient housing for people with homelessness. Our strategies for emergency, interim, and permanent housing, for services and other strategies for people who are unhoused or lack adequate housing. Under goal number 3, housing stability and opportunities to build wealth for all residents. These are strategies that focus on improving renter access to apartments, reducing the number of evictions, mitigating displacement, and helping people in protected classes to improve their resources so that they can also increase their stability. Under goal 4, healthy, thriving neighborhoods with access to good jobs, schools, transportation, and other amenities. These are strategies how the city can better coordinate and focus its investments, ensure that affordable homes are created throughout the city, support local nonprofits and community-based organizations that work to improve their neighborhoods, and how we might put housing near transit. Under goal number 5, racially and socially inclusive neighborhoods that overcome past and present discrimination. Under this goal, we put strategies that focus on specific populations' access to housing, ways to improve the city's decision-making systems to better include members of our community, the planning and measuring the evaluation and accountability that we should do to make progress on becoming more inclusive, and the partners that we will work with on these initiatives. Next slide, please. So finally, the information in chapter 3 is supported by a couple of appendices. So Appendix C, this appendix describes the city's progress in the last housing element cycle. So, on how well the city met its goals and implemented all the actions in that plan. So in that plan, we had a similar list of programs and policies, and several of these strategies, we brought forward and edited for the new housing draft element, and some of them, many of them we completed successfully. Appendix D, this appendix provides an overview of San Jose's available funding for affordable housing and eligible uses, their eligible uses, the funding's eligible uses. This is provided as context of what is available to support the strategies and for, especially in terms of production and preservation of affordable homes in the draft housing element. And I will now pass the mic back to Ruth for the next couple slides.
Thanks, Josh. So chapter 4 is the chapter where we discuss constraints on housing production. And we're looking at the constraints on the supply and production of housing. So this is both for market rate and affordable housing. The state requires that we look at non-governmental and governmental constraints that could be potential barriers to the production of housing. For non-governmental constraints, this includes the cost of land, the cost of construction, and the availability of financing. For governmental constraints, this includes analysis on land use restrictions such as zoning, affordable housing requirements, permitting costs, as well as impact fees and taxes. Next slide. So to create responses to potential constraints, the city held focus group sessions with affordable and market rate housing developers to get detailed feedback. In response to the analysis by staff and also feedback from the development community, the city has proposed several strategies. One is to adopt an ordinance that will allow housing to be approved ministerially if it meets certain requirements. This means that there will not be a public hearing involved in the approval of the project. It could provide time savings and certainty to a developer. The city will also look to complete additional city-led CEQA environmental analysis for areas such as urban villages with adopted plans to help speed up environmental review of these housing projects. This approach is similar to what has been done in downtown San Jose. And with the area-wide analysis done then individual projects can complete their own individual CEQA review much more quickly. The city will also is also considering adding a new staff position to help facilitate affordable housing, especially in the process of obtaining permits to start construction. This person is intended to serve as a single contact that will help navigate within the building division, public works department, and fire. And this position will complement the planner that is dedicated to the entitlement of affordable housing, which is also called the city's destination home planner. The city is also working to improve fee estimation and administration. And these are not the only strategies in the housing element, but the ones specific to the constraints analysis. Next slide. In chapter 5, we describe how the city will accommodate roughly 62,200 new homes during the 8-year planning period. The adequate sites inventory is a list that demonstrates our ability to meet our share of the Bay Area's regional housing need allocation, and it aims to affirmatively further fair housing by planning for more low-income homes in higher opportunity neighborhoods. To increase the probability that these planned homes will actually be built, the site inventory takes into consideration past development trends and present land use restrictions, making it more likely that the picked locations will yield development. Next slide. This table here lists the different categories that we have to meet the ARENA requirement. We have unit categories that are broken up into pipeline or approved projects, ADUs, alternative sites, and then the bulk of it is our opportunity sites, which is the site inventory. And that's the focus of this section. To hedge against the risk of projects not being developed like we expect, the unit capacity of our inventory is more than what is required, with a total buffer of 19.5%. Next slide. We have a map on our website, and I am going to drop the link right now in the chat, but this is where you can find the sites, how many units are planned, and what income level those units are. And this is also in a spreadsheet format in Appendix F. Next slide. I'll hand it over to Paul.
Sorry, Ruth. Hi, thank you for that presentation. So there are a few different ways to provide comments. First and foremost, and immediately during the breakout sessions that we're about ready to go into. Also, we're going to be having an open house, a live open house at the Mexican American Heritage Plaza on Monday, August 8th from 6:30 to 8 o'clock. And we will have interpretation available in both Spanish and Vietnamese. There's also an online comment form that you can go to on the city's website, and someone will put that in the chat right now. And then finally, you can actually send an email to housingelement@San Jose, California, sanjoseca.gov. And the deadline for comments, so this is a 30-day public comment period, and the deadline is Sunday, August 21st at 11:59 p.m. And if you'd like to take a look at the full Housing Element, you can see the URL on the website. It's www.sanjose.gov, Housing Element Update. Next slide, please. So we're now going to go into breakout room discussions, and we'll have 3 different breakout rooms in English and 1 in Spanish. We'll have an initial orientation that the facilitator will walk you through, where we're going to ask folks to take a look at the specific section of the housing element that you'd like to comment on. And then we'll have an open discussion where we'll be asking you what you think about this section of the housing element, what you like, what you think might use improvement, and any other comments or ideas that you have about the draft housing element and the specific section that you're looking at. Our ground rules are: please be curious, keep an open mind, be respectful, and make sure that everyone has space to talk. If you tend to talk a lot, maybe step back a bit. If you're a little bit more reticent about talking, please feel free to step up and provide your comments and your ideas and your questions. Next slide, please. So we have 3 English breakout rooms. The first one, breakout room number 1, will be on housing needs and the assessment of fair housing. And many of you have already indicated to us which of these you're most interested in. So we have an idea of which participants are likely to go into each room. So housing needs assessment of fair housing is group number 1. Group number 2 will deal with housing goals and strategies. So what are the specific strategies and programs that the City of San Jose has included in the draft housing element for addressing future housing needs? And then related to that, group 3 will be about residential sites, the specific land that will be dedicated to affordable housing over the planning period, and what constraints exist to developing affordable housing and all housing on those sites during the planning period. And then finally, Ruth and I will be in group 4. If there's anybody who would like to join us, who speaks Spanish and would prefer to discuss the draft housing element in Spanish. We don't have the ability to record the individual breakout rooms, Jonathan, unfortunately, but we will save the chat and we are taking notes. We have, in addition to a facilitator from Baird and Driscoll and a City of San Jose staff person, we have a note taker who's going to be taking notes that will be shared, and we'll be keeping track of all comments as we go forward. Okay, so with that, I think what I'd like to do is to break out into the breakout rooms and ask the participants to go ahead and select the breakout room that you would prefer. Once again, breakout room number 1 is housing needs. Breakout room number 2 is goals and strategies. And breakout room number 3 is around sites. And Ruth and I will be facilitating breakout room number 4 in Spanish. If you have any questions or not sure which breakout room to go into, then we will, Victor Tran will be in the main room and he can help direct traffic and direct you to the right breakout room. All right, Victor, with that, I think we can open up the breakout rooms. Welcome back, everybody. Hope that you had a lively and rich discussion. We're now going to have our facilitator for each of the rooms report back a little bit on what some of the major themes are that were discussed in each of the rooms. What did folks think about the draft section? What did you hear? And maybe what are some key items that the city might take into account? So let's start, if I can call on group 3 to start with, which is the sites group. And maybe Bubeng, you can give an overview.
Thanks, and I apologize to the group. Kevin finished up mid-sentence. We moved over to the main room mid-sentence and didn't get Roma's comments. So if you could just please add it into the chat so we make sure we have a record of it. But yeah, just the larger buckets of things that we talked about. Really looked into whether or not the individual sites that were all listed were actually feasible. Some people had questions about whether, what was sort of the formula or process in order to make sure that it's feasible. Some folks listed off individual sites and sort of questioned whether or not they could actually build housing there, and also gave us some suggestions for sites that would be great for housing that were not in the inventory. There was all the discussion around sort of market conditions and whether or not the market could sort of create the conditions to build housing in certain places. Also, just general logistics of the actual inventory itself. If the city could make it more accessible by just sharing an Excel spreadsheet, including an address rather than just a parcel number for folks. And then there was a lot of discussion around transit access versus sort of spreading out housing, whether or not affordable housing should really be placed along existing transit routes, or whether or not housing should be spread about to other parts of the city that may or may not have transit. Folks liked a lot of the maps, especially the racial disparity map that was in there. And then there was a question about sort of community input beyond this housing element process at the individual project level. How can that sort of occur as well? And then the 2 additional comments that Kenneth and Roma just sent in as well. That's it.
Great. Thank you very much for that summary, Vu Bang, and thanks everybody who participated in group 3 and for all of your great comments. We are saving the chat in the both in the main room and the breakout rooms, and have taken notes just so you can be reassured that we're keeping track of all of your comments. So let's go to group 1. I know group 1 was maybe more lightly attended than the other groups, but Clara, do you have a summary of what folks discussed?
Hi. Yes, we were a smaller group, but I would say everyone in the group had some pretty great contributions to share. So people found that for the most part, the AFFH analysis that the city's done is pretty thoughtful and progressive, and has done good work going a bit beyond just like kind of what HCD is asking for, provides. There was a couple things that people brought up about bringing in more data around the connections between disability and race and housing needs, looking at really specifically around housing discrimination that landlords are kind of continuing to perpetrate against family status. So specifically people with children, and also this idea of needing to provide more support and recognition around domestic violence and the housing needs specifically associated with that. And I think that I was just trying to look at the notes, but if anybody else wants to share something that they got, but we also, and talked about some testing and beefing up testing. And
When you say testing, what do you mean specifically?
oh, sorry, testing for discrimination. So
got it. Yeah, sort of like mystery shoppers who go out and see if there's possibly discrimination, whether it's passive or active discrimination in the housing markets. Yeah, great. Okay, thank you. David Driscoll, what happened in the goals, policies, and strategies room?
A lot. We were pressed on time, and I want to apologize to Emily Ann Ramos, who got literally, I think, the first word out before we were pulled back into the main room. But encourage folks who have additional comments, details, to submit those in writing. Yeah, we had a lot of comments. I'm not going to go through them all. I think some things, and Kristen, feel free to jump in and add to, but some very specific things around wanting to see the appendix information describing all the community engagement and how many people and different venues, events. Desire to see maybe some beefing up of the evaluation of the current element, which is not in our section that we were looking at, but just sort of that came up. A lot of comments, concerns about implementation of inclusionary zoning and how that works out in specific projects. Wanting to see a distribution around town in specific neighborhoods, areas. Yeah, let's see, I'm just going through our notes really quickly. And a number of comments related to wanting to see more specifics on metrics. How are we going to know that we're hitting the mark? Having more specific numbers about, sort of quantified objectives of that, what are we trying to get to and what does success look like? And then a number of comments saying there's a number of things in there that people like and are happy to see, but want to see some more specifics about how it's actually going to be implemented, and some comments related to timelines about when we're going to get to certain aspects of different programs. I don't know, Kristen, if you have anything else you want to add. We got a lot of.
It's so funny. That's what David heard. I heard a ton of support for preservation strategies and protection strategies. Like I heard the substance a lot more than what David heard, which was with the measurements, and permanent supportive housing and deeply affordable housing was in there. And then some really helpful comments about like, I just didn't see X, or I just didn't really understand the organization of this. And that's helpful for me as an author because it obviously didn't jump out to people who were reading. So thank you for all of those thoughts and comments. And then finally, we did have some comments like that. What part does wage rates play in this, and labor standards? Because that's also part of, well, it's part of wealth building. It's also part of what we work with when we subsidize affordable housing, frankly. But a lot on the preservation note, but a lot of support for COPA. I heard that multiple times. Thank
Good.
you to everyone.
It sounds like we could have had maybe another hour of discussion in the goals.
Yeah, we could have. Well, 127 ideas, you know.
Just
Plenty of
127. Well, you know, San Jose is known
127.
for its innovation and entrepreneurship and great ideas. So, so we had 4 participants in the Spanish room. And Ruth, do you want to summarize, or shall I launch in?
You can go ahead.
Okay. So a lot of concern about rapidly rising rents and how what people can do to get additional resources to help to help deal with rent increases, and to understand what their rights are, and what is legally allowed in terms of rent increases, both in units that are covered by the city's rent control ordinance and maybe units that aren't. So we did talk about there's a specific strategy in the housing element about providing additional resources to connect people, to help people understand what their rights are, and how they can potentially address rent increases. But that was the main discussion point, was really the cost of housing is too high. It's going up very quickly. What can the city do about it? And how can the city better connect people with resources? Do you think that's right, Ruth? Okay. Well, I want to thank everybody on behalf of the Baird and Driscoll team and the City of San Jose staff for your time, for your great ideas, for your participation. Maybe we can go to the next slide, please. We, as I said at the beginning of the meeting, this is just one opportunity of several for you to contribute your ideas on the draft housing element. There will be an in-public meeting, a public open house at the Mexican American Heritage Plaza on August 8th from 6:30 to 8:30. We'll have different stations set up. We'll have food, we'll have coffee. It'll be great. Please come to that. And we will have interpretation in Vietnamese and in Spanish at that meeting as well. You can also go onto the city's website and put in your comments section by section, or you can go to the email that was posted in the chat earlier and send your comments directly via email. So this is a 30-day comment period, which will end on August 21st at 11:59 p.m. And then after that, the city by statute has to take into account the comments for a period of at least 10 business days before turning back around a revised draft to be submitted to the state for review. So thank you very much, everybody, for your time and your participation, and look forward to maybe seeing you in person. Oh, before we go, please, if you have time, fill out this poll, this survey about who you are and your opinions about the meeting. And it would be very helpful to us as we understand who's participating in these meetings and what you think about them and how we can do better. So we'll take just a couple of minutes to leave the poll up as we're closing out. Thank you very much.
Thank you to everyone tonight who came. Thank you to those who couldn't make it tonight, and we'll also comment and appreciate you sharing information with your networks on ways to comment. It's really only through the participation of the community that we're going to get a plan that we really all can buy into. And then, you're going to hold us accountable for getting this work done. So we want it to be the work that we need to get done. We want to get it right. So thank you for your work and your help.